November 12, 1943. A transport truck rumbled through the frozen Canadian countryside, carrying 17 German women toward an uncertain fate. Inside, Greta Hoffmann pressed her face against the cold metal, watching bare trees pass in endless succession. She was 24 years old, a former communications operator for the Wehrmacht, and she had been taught that Canada was a frozen wasteland where the population survived on meager rations, where the war had driven the Allies to the brink of starvation. The propaganda films had shown breadlines stretching for blocks, children with hollow cheeks, a society crumbling under the weight of a war they could not win. The truck stopped at Camp 33, a small facility 2 hours north of Montreal. As the women climbed down, their thin auxiliary uniforms offering little protection, against the November wind, Greta noticed something that contradicted everything she had been told. The Canadian guards standing at attention looked well-fed, not just adequately nourished, but healthy, their cheeks full of color, their uniforms fitting properly over bodies that showed no signs of deprivation. Sergeant William Fraser, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and graying temples, stepped forward to address them in careful German. "Welcome to Camp 33. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, housed, and given work assignments. If you cooperate, your time here will be tolerable." His accent was thick, his grammar imperfect, but the effort itself was surprising. Greta had expected shouting, perhaps violence. Instead, she heard something that sounded almost like courtesy. The women were led to a barracks that, while simple, was warmer than anywhere Greta had slept in months. Wooden bunks lined the walls, each with a mattress that looked surprisingly thick. A wood stove in the center radiated heat. Marlene, a nurse from Berlin who had been captured alongside Greta, whispered in disbelief, "This cannot be real. They are staging this for us. Tomorrow, we will see the truth." But the strangeness continued. As evening approached, Private David Laurent, a young French-Canadian guard with an easy smile, brought them blankets, real wool blankets, not the thin cotton ones they had used in the Auxiliary Corps. When Helga, a radio operator from Munich, asked him in broken English why they were being treated so well, he looked genuinely confused by the question. "You are prisoners, not animals," he said simply. "We do not make war on women by freezing them to death." That night, lying under her wool blanket, Greta stared at the wooden ceiling and felt the first crack in everything she had been taught. The stove kept burning. No one had come to torment them. And tomorrow, they had been told, there would be breakfast. Real breakfast, not the watery soup they had survived on during the final months before their capture. She did not yet know that tomorrow's meal would challenge everything she believed about her enemies, about the war, and about which side was truly facing starvation. Morning light filtered through the barracks windows, waking Greta from the deepest sleep she had experienced in months. The wood stove still radiated warmth, tended through the night by guards who had apparently kept it burning. She heard movement outside, the sounds of a camp coming to life, and then a voice calling in accented German that breakfast would be served in 15 minutes. The 17 women filed into the mess hall with the cautious movements of people expecting a trap. What Greta saw made her stop in the doorway. Long tables were set with metal plates and cups. The smell coming from the kitchen area was rich and sweet, completely unlike the bitter ersatz coffee and stale bread that had become standard in Germany. Corporal Thomas, a stocky guard with a friendly face, gestured for them to sit. "Please," he said in careful German, "sit down. Eat." The kitchen staff emerged carrying large platters, and Greta felt her breath catch. Stacks of golden pancakes, still steaming. A large pitcher of what looked like dark syrup, real butter in generous portions. The women stared in stunned silence. Liesel, the youngest among them, at just 19, whispered, "It must be fake, made from sawdust and chemicals." Corporal Thomas seemed to understand their hesitation. He took a plate, served himself 3 pancakes, poured the dark syrup over them, and cut a large bite. He chewed slowly, deliberately, then smiled. "Real maple syrup," he said. "From trees. We make it every spring." He gestured to the platters. "Please, it will get cold." Marlene was the first to move, her nursing training perhaps making her more practical about food. She took 2 pancakes, a small amount of butter, and stared at the syrup pitcher before pouring just a spoonful over her plate. She cut a tiny piece and brought it to her mouth. Greta watched her friend's face transform. Marlene's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "My God," she whispered, "it is real." The dam broke. The women began serving themselves, some tentatively, others with the desperate hunger of people who had been starving longer than they realized. Greta poured maple syrup over her pancakes and took her first bite. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, nothing like the bitter beet sugar they had used in Germany, nothing like the metallic taste of saccharin. This was sweet the way flowers smelled, the way sunlight felt. This was abundance made edible. Helga set down her fork with shaking hands. "They told us the Allies were starving," she said quietly. "They told us America and Canada had nothing left, that their people were dying in the streets." She gestured at the half-empty platter of pancakes, at the pitcher still full of maple syrup. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? The question hung in the air like smoke, and no one had an answer. The pancake sat heavy. In Greta's stomach, not from indigestion, but from the weight of impossible questions. She spent the morning in the workyard with the other women, assigned to sort supplies for the camp's administrative office. Simple tasks meant to keep them occupied while officials determined their long-term assignments. But her hands moved mechanically while her mind churned through everything she thought she knew about the war. Helga worked beside her, organizing files with the precision that had made her an excellent radio operator. She kept glancing toward the mess hall as if expecting it to vanish, to reveal itself as an elaborate stage set. "Perhaps they are fattening us up," she said quietly in German. "Perhaps this is temporary, to make us compliant before the real treatment begins." But Liesel, sorting through a box of office supplies, held up a pencil. "Look at this," she said. "It is whole, not a stub saved and resharpened a dozen times. They have enough pencils to waste them on prisoner work assignments." She set it down carefully, as if it were made of gold. "In Berlin, my office was using pencils worn down to nothing. We were writing reports with bits of charcoal when we could find it." Marlene had been quiet since breakfast, her face troubled. During the midday break, she pulled Greta aside. "My sister wrote to me 2 months ago, before we were captured. She said their ration was down to 200 grams of bread per day, 200 grams, and we just ate pancakes with real maple syrup." Her voice cracked. "What kind of war is this, where the prisoners eat better than the citizens?" The question tormented all of them. That evening, Private Laurent brought them their dinner, thick vegetable soup with actual chunks of meat, fresh bread that was still warm, and apples, real apples, not the dried ones that had become precious commodities in Germany. Greta held hers like it might disappear, studying the red skin, the way light reflected off its surface. "Where do these come from?" she asked Laurent, in her improving English. He looked confused by the question. "From orchards, from farms. Canada has many farms." He said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if abundance were simply the natural state of things. That night, the women gathered in their barracks after the lights were dimmed. They spoke in hushed German, their voices carrying the weight of dawning realization. "If they have this much food," Greta said slowly, "if they can feed prisoners like this, then they are not losing the war. They were never losing the war." Helga wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Then everything we were told was backwards. We were not defending a homeland against starvation and destruction. We were the ones bringing starvation and destruction." The silence that followed was heavier than any words could be. Outside, the November wind howled through the Canadian pines, but inside the warm barracks, 17 women began the painful process of understanding that they had been fighting on the wrong side. December brought snow to Camp 33, transforming the compound into something that looked almost peaceful. The women had settled into routines, morning work assignments, meals that continued to astonish them with their abundance, evenings in the barracks where they taught each other English phrases and tried to process their new reality. But the arrival of mail from Germany shattered whatever fragile peace they had constructed. Sergeant Fraser distributed the letters during evening assembly, calling names in his careful pronunciation. Greta received two, one from her mother in Hamburg, one from her younger brother stationed somewhere on the Eastern Front. Marlene clutched a single envelope, her hands trembling as she recognized her sister's handwriting. Around the barracks, women tore open their letters with desperate eagerness, hungry for connection to the lives they had left behind. Greta read her mother's letter first. The words were carefully chosen, knowing that military censors would read every line, but the meaning was clear enough. Her mother wrote about the latest ration cuts, about how they were now receiving only 150 grams of meat per week, about how her father had been eating less so that Greta's younger sister could have more. She wrote about the November bombing raids, about neighbors who had lost everything, about the constant fear that shaped every moment of every day. "We are managing," her mother wrote, but Greta could read the exhaustion between the lines, could hear the hunger in words like managing and getting by. Her brother's letter was shorter, hastier, written in pencil on paper so thin she could see through it. He wrote about the cold on the Eastern Front, about boots that were falling apart, about how the men shared a single pair of gloves among 3 soldiers. He tried to sound optimistic, but his words carried the hollow ring of someone trying to convince himself as much as his reader. "We will win," he wrote. "We must win." But Greta, sitting in her warm barracks after an evening meal of roasted chicken and potatoes, knew that her brother was lying to himself. A sound made her look up. Marlene had collapsed onto her bunk, her sister's letter crumpled in her fist. Liesel knelt beside her, but Marlene was beyond comfort. "She is dead," Marlene whispered. "Pneumonia, but really starvation." Her body had nothing left to fight with. She looked up at Greta with eyes that seemed to have aged years in seconds. "My sister died of hunger in October. In October. I was already captured by then. I was already here, eating pancakes with maple syrup while my sister starved to death." Other women were weeping now, their letters carrying similar stories of deprivation, death, and despair. Helga sat with her back against the wall, staring at nothing. "We are warm," she said flatly. "We are fed. We are safe. And our families are dying." She looked around the barracks with something like hatred. What are we supposed to do with this? How are we supposed to live with knowing that our enemies take better care of us than our own country takes care of our families? No one had an answer. Outside, snow continued to fall softly on the Canadian pines, beautiful and indifferent to the weight of guilt settling over 17 German women who were learning that sometimes the cruelest thing is not suffering yourself, but being spared while those you love suffer in your place. January 19, 1944. Corporal Thomas approached Greta during morning work detail with an unusual proposal. "Some of the women have been asking about the maple syrup," he said in his improving German. "They think we are lying about where it comes from. Would you and a few others like to see a sugar bush, to understand that this is real?" Greta translated for the others, and the response was immediate curiosity mixed with suspicion. Helga voiced what several were thinking. Why would they show us this? What are they trying to prove? But the following Saturday, 8 women, including Greta, Marlene, Helga, and Liesel, were loaded into a truck with Corporal Thomas and Private Laurent. They drove for 40 minutes through snow-covered countryside that seemed to stretch forever. Greta pressed her face against the cold window, watching farmhouses pass, each with smoke rising from chimneys, each looking solid and permanent. She thought of the bombed-out neighborhoods in Hamburg, of buildings reduced to rubble, of families living in basements because the upper floors no longer existed. The truck stopped at a large property where a French-Canadian family named Bergeron operated a maple syrup farm. "Monsieur Bergeron?" A weathered man in his 60s greeted them with a warmth that seemed completely at odds with the fact that they were enemy prisoners. His wife had prepared hot tea, and their teenage son helped translate when Corporal Thomas's German failed him. "Come," Monsieur Bergeron said through the translation chain. "I show you the trees." They walked into a forest of maple trees, hundreds of them, their bare branches reaching toward a gray winter sky. Monsieur Bergeron explained through gestures and broken sentences that in spring, when the sap began to flow, they would tap these trees. He showed them the equipment, metal spouts that would be driven into the bark, buckets that would collect the clear sap, the sugar house where the sap would be boiled down into syrup. 40 liters of sap, he explained, made 1 liter of syrup. Liesel reached out to touch one of the maple trees, her hand resting on the rough bark. "All of this," she said quietly in German, "just grows here? No one planted these trees for the war effort? They were just here?" Monsieur Bergeron's son understood enough German to catch her meaning. "These trees are older than my grandfather," he said. "They will be here long after the war ends. This is just what we do, what we have always done." Greta felt something shift inside her chest. In Germany, everything had been organized for the war. What you ate, what you wore, where you worked, what you were allowed to think. Every resource was measured and rationed and controlled. But here was abundance that existed outside of war, that predated it and would survive it. Here were trees that had been producing sweetness for generations, not because some government official had ordered it, but because that was simply their nature. Back in the sugar house, Madame Bergeron served them tea and small maple sugar candies she had made. The women ate slowly, reverently. Marlene held a candy in her palm, as if weighing it. "My sister never tasted anything like this," she said quietly. "She lived her whole life and died without knowing this existed." Her voice carried no anger, only a profound sadness that seemed to fill the warm sugar house like smoke. On the drive back to camp, the women were silent. Greta watched the Canadian landscape roll past and understood that they had been shown something more dangerous than any weapon. They had been shown the truth, that abundance was possible, that life could exist beyond the constant state of emergency that had defined their entire adult lives, that perhaps the scarcity they had known was not inevitable, but imposed. And once you knew that truth, there was no way to unknow it. The visit to the Bergeron farm had opened a wound that would not close. In the days that followed, the barracks became a place of heated, whispered debates that stretched late into the night. The women gathered on bunks in small groups, speaking in rapid German that carried the intensity of people whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered. Helga had become the voice of resistance, clinging to what they had been taught with the desperation of someone who knew that letting go meant admitting she had been complicit in terrible things. "Perhaps Canada is different," she argued one evening, her voice tight with strain. "Perhaps they have resources that Germany never had. That does not mean we were lied to about everything." But Liesel, who had been the youngest and most naive among them, had transformed into their most fierce questioner. "They told us the Allies were starving," she said, her voice steady despite her youth. "They showed us propaganda films of bread lines and suffering. But we have been here 2 months now, and we eat better than we ever did in Germany, even before the war. Even in the good years, we never had food like this." Greta sat on her bunk, thinking about the maple trees, about abundance that existed simply because it existed, not because someone in a uniform had decreed it. "It is not just about the food," she said slowly. "It is about what the food means. If they lied about something so basic, so easy to verify, then what else was a lie?" Marlene, who had barely spoken since learning of her sister's death, finally broke her silence. "They told us we were defending civilization," she said, her voice hollow. "They told us the Allies wanted to destroy our culture, our way of life. But which civilization burns books? Which civilization builds camps for its own citizens? Which civilization lets children starve while feeding soldiers? She looked around at the warm barracks, at the evidence of their captors' humanity. We were not defending civilization. We were defending the people destroying it. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Helga stood abruptly, her face flushed. "We cannot know what is true anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "If everything we believed was a lie, then who are we? What were we fighting for?" She pressed her hands against her temples, as if trying to hold her thoughts together. "My father was a party member. My brothers are still fighting. If we were wrong about everything, then what does that make them? What does that make me?" Greta understood Helga's fear because she felt it herself. Accepting the truth meant accepting that they had been tools of something monstrous, that their service had not been noble or necessary, but had instead contributed to immeasurable suffering. It meant looking at their own hands and seeing blood, even if they had never personally pulled a trigger. "It makes us human," Liesel said quietly. "Humans who were lied to, humans who believed the lies, and now humans who have to decide what to do with the truth." Outside, the January wind howled through the pines, but inside the barracks, 17 women sat with the weight of knowledge they could never unlearn, the burden of truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. February brought a thaw to Camp 33, the snow melting into mud that turned the compound into a maze of careful stepping. Corporal Thomas had been watching the German women with growing concern, seeing how the weight of their realization was crushing something essential inside them. One evening, he asked Sergeant Fraser for permission to speak with them informally, outside the usual structure of guard and prisoner. He entered the barracks after dinner, carrying a worn photo album that looked decades old. The women looked up in surprise as he settled onto a chair near the wood stove, gesturing for them to gather around if they wished. Greta translated as he began to speak, his voice carrying a gentle authority. "My grandparents came to Canada from Ukraine in 1908, he said, opening the album to show faded photographs of stern-faced people in old-fashioned clothing. They were starving. The crops had failed 3 years running. They sold everything they owned for passage on a ship, and they arrived in Halifax with 2 suitcases and 7 children." He turned the page, showing a photograph of a rough wooden house, barely more than a shack. "This was their first home in Saskatchewan. My grandfather cleared the land himself, pulled stumps. With horses, broke the soil. My grandmother grew vegetables, kept chickens, learned to preserve food for winters that lasted 6 months. His finger traced the edge of the photograph. "They were so poor that my father said he did not taste white sugar until he was 12 years old." Liesel leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the album. "But now," she said hesitantly, "now, Canada has so much." Thomas nodded slowly. "Now, yes, but it took 30 years of work. My grandparents built something from nothing because they were given the chance to do so. Land, freedom, the opportunity to keep what they grew." He looked up at the women. "That is what we are fighting to preserve. Not because we have always had abundance, but because we know what it is like to build it from nothing." He turned to another photograph, this one more recent, showing a young woman in a wedding dress. "My sister," he said. "She married a man whose parents came from Germany, 1923. They were fleeing the inflation, the chaos. They arrived with nothing, and now they own a bakery in Toronto." He met Greta's eyes. "Do you understand what I am telling you? We are not your enemies because we hate Germans. We are your enemies because we are fighting against people who want to take away the world where my sister can marry the son of German immigrants and build a life together." Marlene spoke quietly. "But we thought we were defending Germany. We thought we were the ones protecting our way of life." Thomas closed the album carefully. "I know. That is what makes this war so tragic. You were told you were defending your home, when really you were helping to destroy it." He stood, tucking the album under his arm. "The question now is what you do with that knowledge." After he left, the women sat in silence. the weight of his words settling over them like snow. December 24th, 1944. The women had been prisoners for over a year now, and the approach of their second Christmas in captivity brought complicated emotions. They had received more letters from home, each one carrying news that made the contrast between their situation and their family's suffering even more unbearable. Greta's brother had written about eating boiled grass to supplement their rations. Liesel's mother described how they burned furniture for heat because there was no coal. Sergeant Fraser had announced that morning that there would be a special Christmas dinner, and the women had spent the day helping prepare the mess hall. They hung simple decorations made from paper and pine branches, their hands moving mechanically while their minds dwelt on everything they had lost. When evening came and they filed into the decorated hall, nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. The tables were laden with food that seemed impossible even after a year of witnessing Canadian abundance. A roasted turkey so large it barely fit on its platter, golden and glistening. Bowls of mashed potatoes, with real butter melting on top. Carrots glazed with something sweet. Fresh rolls that filled the air with the smell of yeast and warmth. Cranberry sauce, green beans, and in the center of each table, small bowls of maple sugar candies shaped like stars. But it was the dessert table that made Marlene press her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Pies, apple, pumpkin, and mincemeat. A chocolate cake with real frosting. Cookies in shapes of trees and bells. Pitchers of cream so thick it barely poured. This was not simply abundance. This was excess. Luxury. The kind of plenty that her sister would never have believed existed, even if Marlene had found the words to describe it. Corporal Thomas stood before them, his voice gentle as he spoke. "We know this is difficult. We know many of you are thinking of your families tonight, but we want you to understand something. This is not propaganda. This is not us trying to prove anything. This is simply how we celebrate Christmas in Canada. This is normal for us." That word, normal, hit Greta like a physical blow. Normal. While her mother rationed 100 grams of bread to last 3 days, this was normal for the people she had been taught to call enemies. While her brother's unit shared frozen potatoes among 6 soldiers, Canadian families sat down to tables like this and called it normal. The women ate slowly, reverently, some with tears streaming down their faces. The food was delicious, but it tasted of guilt and grief. Helga set down her fork after 3 bites and could not continue. Liesel ate mechanically, her eyes distant. Greta forced herself to finish what was on her plate, feeling that somehow it would be disrespectful to waste it, though she could not have said who she would be disrespecting, her hosts or her starving family. After dinner, Private Laurent brought out his fiddle and played Christmas carols. Some of the women sang along in German, their voices breaking. It was the most painful celebration any of them had ever experienced, a feast that felt like mourning. The day after Christmas, Sergeant Fraser provided the women with paper, envelopes, and stamps for writing letters home. It was a regular privilege, offered monthly, but this time it felt different. The women sat at tables in the common room, pens in hand, staring at blank pages as if they were impossible puzzles to solve. Greta chewed the end of her pen, thinking about what she could possibly write to her mother. How could she describe the Christmas feast without it sounding like cruel boasting? How could she tell her brother about the abundance here without making his suffering on the Eastern Front seem even more pointless? The German censors would read every word, and anything that sounded like Allied propaganda would be struck through or cause the entire letter to be confiscated. Around her, the other women struggled with the same impossible task. Liesel had written and crumpled 3 different attempts, her wastebasket overflowing with false starts. Marlene sat with her pen hovering over paper, unable to write a single word to the family of her dead sister. What could she possibly say that would not sound like betrayal? "I cannot tell them the truth," Helga said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "If I write that we are well fed, that we are warm, that our captors treat us with kindness, they will think I have been brainwashed, or worse, they will hate me for living comfortably while they suffer. She set down her pen with shaking hands. But if I lie and say we are being mistreated, I participate in the same lies that brought us here in the first place. Greta found herself nodding. It was an impossible choice. Participate in the propaganda that had deceived them, or tell a truth that would wound their families even more deeply than the lies. She thought of Corporal Thomas's words about his grandparents, about building something from nothing. She thought of the maple trees producing sweetness simply because that was their nature. Finally, she began to write. She told her mother that she was safe, that she was healthy, that she was learning English. She described the snow, the pine trees, the way the Canadian winter wrapped everything in white silence. She said nothing about the food, nothing about the abundance, but she wrote something else instead. I am learning that the world is larger than we were told. I am learning that people are more complicated than we believed. I hope that when this war ends, we will all have the chance to see clearly what we could not see before. It was careful language, coded enough to pass the censors, but honest enough to let her mother know that something fundamental had changed. Around her, other women began writing similar letters, each finding her own way to acknowledge transformation without betraying either their families or the truth they had learned. Marlene finally put pen to paper, writing to her surviving brother. Anna would have wanted us to learn from this, she wrote simply. She would have wanted us to be better than we were. It was not much, but it was honest, and honesty was all they had left to offer. June 15, 1963. Greta Hoffman stood in the kitchen of her Montreal home, mixing batter for pancakes while morning sunlight streamed through the windows. She had married a Canadian teacher named Robert in 1948, taken his last name, and built a life that her 24-year-old self could never have imagined. Her children, Anna and Thomas, named after people who had shown her kindness when she needed it most, were setting the table for a special breakfast. Today, her brother Klaus was arriving from Hamburg with his wife and 2 daughters. It would be his first visit to Canada, the first time Greta had seen him since before the war. They had corresponded regularly over the years, careful letters that traced the parallel paths their lives had taken after that terrible conflict. Klaus had returned from the Eastern Front, weighing 45 kilograms, more ghost than man. He had rebuilt his life slowly, becoming a teacher like Greta's husband, dedicating himself to ensuring that future generations understood what nationalism and propaganda could do to a society. The doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. Greta wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, her heart pounding with an emotion she could not quite name. When she opened the door, Klaus stood there, now 52 years old, his hair gray, but his eyes still the same ones she remembered from their childhood. They embraced without words, holding each other as tears flowed freely. After the initial reunions, after introducing children and spouses, after the awkward small talk that follows 20 years of separation, Greta led them all to the dining room. The table was set simply, plates, forks, and in the center, a tall stack of golden pancakes still steaming from the griddle. Beside them sat a glass pitcher filled with dark amber maple syrup. Klaus stared at the pitcher, his hand reaching out slowly, as if it might vanish. "Is that?" he began, then stopped. His wife touched his arm gently. Greta picked up the pitcher and poured maple syrup over the pancakes in a generous stream. "Real maple syrup," she said quietly in German. "From trees, just like I tried to explain in my letters all those years ago." She served her brother first, watching as he cut a piece and brought it to his mouth. His eyes closed, and for a moment he looked exactly as Greta had felt 20 years earlier in a prisoner of war camp, tasting something that contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. When he opened his eyes, they were full of tears. "All those years," he whispered, "I thought you were exaggerating. I thought maybe you had forgotten what things were really like, that time had made you remember it differently." He looked down at the pancakes. "But you were telling the truth. They really did have all of this while we were starving." Greta sat down across from him, reaching across the table to take his hand. "The truth," she said, "is what saved me, and now you know it too."